John, to start with, how would you describe the uniqueness of the relationship between religion and politics in America and an American election?
There are two aspects to American religion that are quite important politically. One of them is religious affiliation, what groups people belong to. But then there's religiosity, that is, to the extent that people practice their faith, whatever that faith may be. And what we've seen over the last 30 years is that religiosity has become relatively more important in terms of the vote, and religious affiliation has become relatively less important. And it divides many religious communities. There are large divisions among mainline Protestants and Roman Catholics over religiosity, with more traditionally religious people tending to vote more Republican and be more conservative, and less traditionally religious people, not non-religious, but less traditionally religious people tending to be somewhat more liberal and vote more Democratic. This creates a lot of tension in politics, but also a lot of tension within these religious communities.
Now, in the United Kingdom, the idea of having a lawmaker do God talk is almost like writing a suicide note to the electorate. In America, it's more like a love letter. They seem to have to do it. How do you observe that difference?
Our political leaders talk a lot about their faith, but they tend to talk about it in very general ways rather than very specific ways. And in that regard, the United States is very different from the United Kingdom, is very different from many other European countries. It's not just that our politicians need to talk about their faith because of the political circumstances, but many of them enjoy talking about their faith. And there's been a lot of emphasis on more conservative politicians, but frankly, many of our moderate and liberal politicians also like to talk about their faith, President Obama being a good example of that.
Let's go to the other side of the equation, away from the politicians to the faith traditions themselves. In America, what struck me is that they are much more politicized than, for instance, in the United Kingdom.
I think that is true. I think the religious traditions in the United States have and still are highly politicized. Part of that is because of just the enormous diversity of the American religious landscape, and groups are constantly tripping over each other and running into each other when matters of public policy come up. But to be fair, there's also a growing and very important non-religious group in the United States that in its own respects is just as diverse as the religious communities, ranging all the way from atheists to people who are just rather indifferent to religion, to people who regard themselves as quite religious. They're just not involved in organized religion, very much on purpose.
You talked about the size of some of these religious denominations, traditions. Do you think the idea of the religious bloc vote that figures leaders like Jim Wallis or Archbishop Dolan can deliver their legions is actually a myth?
It very largely is a myth about delivering blocks of voters. One of the elections that a lot of people know about where religion figured very prominently was the 1960 presidential election. There really wasn't a Catholic bloc vote. Now, many Roman Catholics voted for John F. Kennedy, and perhaps because they had a similar faith, but it wasn't because the bishops and other Catholic leaders told them to do that. And even today, when we think about the evangelical vote, or we think about the Mormon vote, or we think about the Jewish vote, it's really not commanded by religious leaders. It's persuaded through the democratic process. So, for instance, evangelical Protestants, very strong Republican constituency, only vote about 3/4 Republican, which is to say that about 1/4 vote Democratic. So religion and religious affiliation is a lens through which people see politics, but it's not a set of commands that line them up in one party or the other.
You said earlier this year on NPR, and I quote, "An awful lot of people do see religion of one kind or another as being the basis of morality." So the question is religion the only way a candidate can relay morality to the public? And based on those surveys, do you think we would ever see an atheist get elected in America?
There are many ways that candidates can communicate their own moral values to the public, but a particularly powerful one in the United States is by talking about their faith and by demonstrating their practice of their faith. And that's because we see in survey after survey that many millions of Americans see in their own lives the basis of morality being in faith. their particular faith, but also the faith of their neighbors, the faith of their relatives. The flip side of that, though, is candidates that don't talk about their faith, or perhaps don't have very much because they're not religious, have a difficult time communicating those basic values to voters. It would be very difficult for an atheist to be elected president of the United States. For that reason alone, for the presidency of the United States, a candidate that has to appeal to the population as a whole, a lack of religious faith is a detriment.
Professor Green, it's a fascinating topic, and I'm sure it'll get even more fascinating as we get closer to the election. Thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome.